pressed into clay, before it hardened under the sun and learned to endure. There was the city itself, breathing quietly along the bend of the Euphrates. Uruk did not announce its beginnings. It gathered them slowly, brick by brick, layer by layer, as hands learn the weight of wet earth and feet learn the patience of distance. Mudbrick walls rose not as monuments but as necessities, their surfaces smoothed by palms that knew the river's moods. Canals cut through the land like deliberate thoughts, carrying water inward and waste away, binding the fields to the streets and the streets to the temples. In the early mornings, before heat settled, labor moved without spectacle. Men and women bent to routine tasks, hauling baskets, shaping bricks, clearing silt. The city's sound was not noise but texture, the scrape of reed sandals, the low murmur of exchange, the slap of water against embankment stone. Uruk was not yet a story. It was a system that functioned because memory lived in repetition, and authority existed as something felt rather than proclaimed. The city's scale mattered, though it was rarely spoken of directly. Its walls did not simply enclose space. They organized attention. Inside them, time moved differently. Ritual calendars structured the year, marking when grain would be stored, when offerings would be made, when silence was required. Temples rose above surrounding dwellings, not through height alone, but through accumulation of meaning. Each brick carried the residue of earlier hands, earlier vows. Smoke from offerings drifted into corridors and courtyards, carrying scents of fat and grain that clung to clothing long after prayers ended. In shaded rooms, scribes practiced marks not yet destined for epic, recording deliveries, debts, distributions. Writing here was not narrative, it was management. It was control made legible. The city remembered itself through these records, even as individual lives passed without inscription. Power in early Uruk did not always speak loudly. It settled into rooms where decisions were made with minimal gesture. Elders gathered, priests conferred, administrators measured. Authority flowed along familiar paths, reinforced by custom rather than force. The city did not need constant assertion of rule because its structure did that work quietly. Canals directed movement, storehouses regulated survival, ritual enforced hierarchy without spectacle. Those who lived within Uruk learned early, where they stood by how space received them. Some rooms were open, some were barred, some required purification before entry. The city taught obedience through architecture and rhythm, not decree. Within this environment, memory was collective before it was personal. Stories circulated, but they were local, provisional, shaped by season and need. A flood remembered here was not the same flood remembered there. Names mattered less than functions. A strong man was known for labor. A wise woman was known for ritual precision. The future king, whoever he might be, was not yet separate from this mesh of expectation. He would emerge from it, shaped by its constraints. Gilgamesh, in this sense, was inevitable not as an individual, but as a role produced by density, surplus, and scale. Uruk required a figure through which authority could be focused. The river made this possible. Its cycles dictated prosperity and risk, abundance and loss. Watching it was a skill learned over years, passed quietly between generations. When it rose too fast, the city adjusted. When it receded too far, prayers changed. Water bound Uruk to landscapes beyond its walls, to distant fields and settlements that fed its population. Trade followed these routes, slow and deliberate. Couriers moved between points, carrying messages that rarely spoke of glory. They spoke of quantities, delays, obligations. Their footsteps traced invisible lines of connection long before borders were named. As Uruk expanded, its need to remember grew more complex. Oral knowledge no longer sufficed. What could once be held in shared recollection began to slip. Writing answered this need not by preserving everything, but by selecting. What was written gained weight. What was not written remained vulnerable. This quiet distinction shaped the city's future narratives. Long before myth, there was omission. Long before heroism, there was administration. The city's earliest texts did not sing. They counted. They stabilized reality by reducing it to marks that could be checked and enforced. In this setting, identity was inseparable from place. To belong to Uruk was to accept its rhythms, its demands, its silences. Outsiders were noticed not for who they were, but for how they moved incorrectly through space. Inside the walls, even dissent took familiar forms. Tension existed, but it rarely surfaced as rupture. Instead, it pressed inward, absorbed by ritual and routine. The city had learned to survive itself. Gilgamesh, when he would later be named, did not step into emptiness. He stepped into corridors already worn smooth, into expectations older than his birth. His authority would be inseparable from the city's architecture, its memory systems, its labor networks. The walls that later bore his name were already teaching him how power functioned. Strength here was not only physical, it was administrative, it was ritual competence, it was the ability to align oneself with the city's sense of order. Seen from this distance, Uruk does not feel ancient so much as deliberate. Its people were not waiting for legend, they were maintaining balance. They were solving problems that came with scale. The epic would later give these processes faces and conflicts. But at their origin they were quiet, technical, and necessary. The city did not know it was preparing a story. It was preparing continuity. When the sun fell and shadows lengthened across courtyards, lamps were lit in rooms where records were stored. Clay tablets rested on shelves, drying, hardening, becoming memory. Each one carried a fragment of the city's awareness of itself. Together, they formed an archive without intention of poetry. And yet, within that archive, the conditions for myth were already present. Not because anyone sought them, but because, when power, memory, and place converge, story becomes inevitable. Uruk endured not by chance, but by design. Its systems absorbed individuals, shaped them, and passed them unaltered. The city was the first author. Everything that followed would be written within the margins it established. In the deeper chambers of Uruk, where light thinned and voices softened, kingship was not announced but assembled, piece by careful piece, through habits of record and restraint. Authority here did not arrive with ceremony alone. It arrived with tablets, seals, and the slow accumulation of written agreement. The palace was less a stage than a workshop of power, its rooms modest in size, its corridors narrow, its walls close enough to hold whispers. Within them, scribes sat cross-legged beside low tables, their reed styluses moving with deliberate pressure into damp clay. Each mark carried consequence. Each omission did as well. Writing was not merely communication, it was filtration. What entered the record entered permanence. What remained unmarked dissolved into lived memory and then into silence. Temples, too, participated in this process. Their archives grew dense with offerings tallied, labor assigned, land measured. The divine was not separate from administration. It was embedded within it. To write was to align human order with cosmic expectation. Tablets were dried in shaded spaces, stacked in baskets, sorted by subject rather than sentiment. Over time, they formed a quiet infrastructure of legitimacy. Kings ruled not only by strength or lineage, but by their position within this textual web. A ruler who disrupted it too violently risked erasure as much as revolt. Silence, in this context, was not absence, it was control. Decisions were made in small rooms where only a few were present, and fewer still spoke. The weight of kingship pressed inward, shaping posture and tone. Gilgamesh, when he appears within this world, does so already constrained by its mechanisms. He is not a figure shouting against a system, but one raised within it, educated by it, reliant upon it. His name, when impressed into clay, gains a stability his body never could. The act of naming fixes him within the city's memory, but also subjects him to its editorial instincts. Scribes chose titles carefully, deeds were summarized, conflicts softened, excess translated into acceptable forms. The king's image was refined through repetition, not invention. Over years, a version of rulership emerged that felt natural because it had been written so often. Palaces stored more than wealth. They stored precedent. Drawers and shelves held tablets that could be retrieved when questions arose about boundaries, obligations, or succession. In these moments the past was consulted not as story but as evidence. The authority of the present depended on the arrangement of these fragments. A king who understood this understood survival. Those who did not were corrected quietly, their actions reframed by others before damage spread. The city preferred continuity to disruption. Even divine favor was recorded with care. Offerings logged, rituals scheduled, outcomes noted. The gods themselves were drawn into the system, their will interpreted through signs that required trained eyes to read. This placed priests and scribes in positions of subtle power. They did not rule, but they shaped the conditions under which rule was remembered. Gilgamesh's strength, his restlessness, his ambition, all passed through this narrow aperture. What emerged was not the man entire, but a version suitable for preservation. Silence protected the system from contradiction. Not everything needed to be said. Not everything could be written. The laborer's fatigue, the widow's complaint, the failed harvest quietly absorbed by temple reserves, these rarely reached a tablet unless they threatened balance. Writing was selective by necessity. Clay was finite. Attention was limited. Over time, this selectivity became habit, then ideology. The record did not lie, but it did not include everything. Kingship learned to live within this boundary. The ruler's presence was reinforced by what was consistently recorded and by what was consistently left out. Gilgamesh's authority, as later generations would encounter it, was already shaped by these early decisions. He was remembered as builder, judge, warrior, but always within the acceptable grammar of rule. Excess was transmuted into symbolism. Violence became order. Desire became quest. The machinery behind this transformation was quiet and persistent. Scribes aged at their tables. Styluses wore down. New apprentices learned which marks mattered most. In the evenings, when lamps flickered and shadows moved across walls, tablets were reviewed, corrected, sometimes discarded. Memory was curated. Kingship depended on this curation. Without it, power fragmented. With it, power endured beyond death. Gilgamesh, bound to this system, became both subject and beneficiary of its discipline. He ruled within a silence that was not empty, but dense with unspoken agreement. The city listened through its records. It remembered through its omissions. And in this balance between inscription and absence, early Mesopotamian kingship found its lasting form, steady, restrained, and inseparable from the clay that bore its weight. Long before the Epic of Gilgamesh hardened into lines of clay and traveled beyond the city that shaped it, the story existed as movement, voice, and repetition, carried through courtyards and temple steps by those who remembered, not for preservation but for continuity. Words were spoken aloud in measured rhythms, shaped by breath and pause, altered slightly with each telling to suit the season, the audience, the ritual purpose. In these early forms, the story was not fixed. It was responsive, bending to context, absorbing local concerns, releasing others. A tale told during a festival differed from one murmured during mourning. Performance mattered as much as content. Gesture, silence, and shared familiarity filled gaps that later texts would feel compelled to close. Over time, as Uruk expanded and its influence reached outward, these spoken narratives began to attract attention from those whose role it was to stabilize meaning. The scribes listened not as participants, but as collectors. What they heard passed through layers of judgment before it reached clay. Certain episodes repeated often, gaining weight through familiarity. Others appeared irregularly, tied to specific memories or grievances, and these were easier to lose. The act of writing transformed the story's nature. What had once lived in variation now required coherence. Contradictions were smoothed. Sequences were aligned. Emotional excess was measured against expectation. In small rooms lit by oil lamps, scribes debated phrasing, deciding which metaphors carried authority and which introduced uncertainty. The epic did not emerge whole. It accumulated through selection. Ritual performances continued alongside this process, reinforcing approved versions through repetition. Temples became stages where sanctioned narratives were recited, their cadence reinforcing hierarchy and cosmology. The gods within the story grew more defined, their actions more consistent, their judgments clearer. Human figures, too, were adjusted. Gilgamesh's restlessness became symbolic rather than disruptive. His grief was shaped into lesson rather than complaint. Themes that threatened stability were redirected toward universals: mortality, friendship, restraint. The machinery of memory worked quietly here, not through suppression alone but through emphasis. What was useful endured, what was awkward faded. As generations passed, scribes inherited not only tablets but assumptions. They learned how the story was supposed to sound. Variants still existed, stored in regional archives, remembered by different communities, but the central narrative gained gravity. Editorial hands intervened with reverence rather than audacity. They did not invent, they refined. A line removed was replaced by implication. A violent act was reframed as necessity. The story's edges grew smoother with each iteration. Clay tablets bore traces of this process. Erasures remained faintly visible. Marginal notes hinted at alternatives no longer pursued. In some cases, entire sections were reorganized to improve moral clarity. The epic became less a mirror of lived complexity and more a guide to acceptable interpretation. Yet this was not deception. It was alignment. Empires require stories that travel well. The Epic of Gilgamesh was shaped to do so, carrying Uruk's values into unfamiliar spaces without provoking resistance. Oral tradition did not vanish. It adapted. Storytellers learned which elements resonated with the written version and leaned into them. Over time, memory conformed to record. Children heard the story already filtered. What once might have been debated became assumed. The epic's authority grew not from force but from ubiquity. It was present in rituals, education, diplomacy. Silent couriers carried tablets between cities, their contents read aloud in foreign halls, translated not only linguistically but culturally. Each reading reinforced the version deemed complete. The unseen machinery behind this process remained largely invisible. Scribes aged and died, archives shifted, floods destroyed some collections while preserving others. Chance played its role, but intention guided the broader arc. The epic survived because it fit. It spoke to power without undermining it. It acknowledged loss without encouraging despair. It allowed kings to see themselves reflected without being challenged. Gilgamesh, as remembered, was no longer simply a man of Uruk. He was an instrument through which societies could explore limits safely. This transformation required patience. It unfolded over centuries, through countless small decisions made without awareness of their cumulative effect. The result was a text that felt ancient even to those closest to it, its origins obscured by its authority. What was removed left little trace, not because it lacked importance, but because absence rarely announces itself. The Epic of Gilgamesh, as it reached us, is therefore not a single inheritance, but a curated memory, shaped by hands that valued continuity over completeness. It carries within it the texture of rooms where choices were made quietly, of lamps burning low as lines were weighed, of voices deciding what future generations would know. The story's endurance lies not in its perfection but in its restraint. It does not shout, it does not demand, it remains, steady and composed, a testament to how civilizations remember themselves by choosing carefully what to carry forward and what to let dissolve into silence. In the dim, quiet recesses of Uruk's archives, among shelves bowed under the weight of drying clay tablets, there exist gaps that speak as loudly as the marks themselves. These absences are often invisible to those who seek only narrative clarity, yet they shape understanding as insistently as any preserved line. Tablets break, crumble, or vanish entirely, leaving only the impression of thought, the ghost of a story that was never fully captured. In the rooms where scribes labored, hands pressed against clay, the act of omission was often unconscious, dictated by practicality, ritual, or hierarchy. Lines that recorded complaint, revolt, or labor unrest were edited or excluded not because someone sought deception, but because the city demanded stability. A scribe's focus was rarely the dramatic, and the small room in which he sat, lit by a single oil lamp whose smoke clung to beams, amplified the quiet weight of his choices. Each decision to leave a line incomplete or to rephrase an act of violence was mediated by what was permissible for record, by what the gods might sanction, and by what the city could endure. Broken tablets tell the story of fragility as much as their words do. Splintered edges, faded impressions, and the occasional smudge of water damage mark the limits of preservation and reveal the delicate process by which memory was maintained. A missing line in the sequence of an event does not simply erase it, it transforms it, leaving narrative lacunae that later scribes, readers, or rulers must navigate. Some passages, inferred only by repetition elsewhere, hint at labor strikes that disrupted the canals, or at harvests withheld by divine disfavor, or at interpersonal violence that never reached ceremonial record. These fragments, half-glimpsed through shadowed archives, suggest tensions beneath the city's apparent order, the invisible strain of those who built, transported, and sustained the burdens of mortals whose deaths or descent were rarely chronicled. Mortality itself appears selectively. The king's grief is preserved, the common man's loss is absent. Temples and palaces curated memory through omission, yet in these omissions, a hidden structure emerges, revealing what the society valued and what it chose to contain. Even the divine was mediated by absence. Deities appear in surviving tablets as ordered and consistent, their interventions legible and codified. But what is missing? The moments of anger, the lapses of protection, the intimations of arbitrary caprice remains almost entirely silent. A scribe could note a flood, a famine, or the failure of ritual, but rarely the uncertainty underlying those events. In these omissions, the city found balance, prioritizing continuity over completeness. Couriers who transported tablets between cities contributed to this selective preservation. They read passages aloud to recipients, emphasizing sanctioned sections and glossing over fragmented lines, unaware that what was left unspoken would shape understanding for generations. Messages were carried on red boats along the Euphrates, the quiet splash of paddles punctuating the otherwise still nights, connecting archives but also amplifying what was deemed acceptable memory. As tablets were copied, Broken lines were sometimes reconstructed from context, yet even these reconstructions introduced interpretation, layering absence with inference. Each editorial choice, however minor, reinforced the cultural machinery that preserved imperial stability. Social tensions were present in the narrative only when they could be framed safely. Rebellion became mythologized. Labor unrest transformed into anecdote. Acts of violence presented as divine test or heroic necessity. These transformations occurred gradually, mediated through repeated recitation, through copying, through the deliberation of scribes who learned what could endure without threatening the fragile web of civic order. The result is a record that feels complete yet is inherently partial, an artifact not of storytelling but of cultural negotiation. In small rooms, far from the city's bustle, weighty decisions were made over tiny marks. A line left unwritten, a word erased, a phrase replaced by ambiguity, or were acts of preservation as much as omission. Shadows of human experience linger in these choices, detectable to those who approach with patience and attention. They reveal a city attentive to survival, unwilling to record disruption fully, yet unwilling also to erase life entirely. Broken tablets, smudged lines, and missing passages preserve absence as substance, hinting at the unseen pressures that shaped every act of memory. In studying them, one senses not a conspiracy but the natural evolution of record, the organic process through which empire secures continuity. The city's stability depended on the alignment of ritual, labor, and authority, and narrative served as both tool and reflection of this alignment. Violence that might threaten perception was often translated into myth. Mortality was filtered into lesson. Suffering was framed as participation in divine order. Even intimate acts, familial quarrels, private grief, clandestine meetings rarely appear, their absence silently instructive. The remaining tablets, arranged in careful rows on shadowed shelves, attest to both presence and lack. Margins, erasures, and faded impressions indicate attention and neglect, highlighting what mattered and what could be tolerated as missing. The process was cumulative. Scribes trained in the art of discernment learned what to include, what to soften, what to leave unsaid. Ritual reinforced these choices, ensuring that omission itself became habitual and normative. In this way, the epic and other narratives that survived are as much defined by silence as by inscription. Reading them demands attention to both what is present and what is absent. Scholars may reconstruct events from context, but they must also reckon with the deliberate and accidental lacunae that shape understanding. Gilgamesh, like the city that produced him, emerges within these constraints, a figure whose remembered deeds are measured as much by selective preservation as by lived reality. Absent lines hint at labor disputes, unrecorded rivalries, and tensions between mortal and divine expectations. Yet these absences are not scandalous. They are functional, part of a larger rhythm of memory management that prioritizes cohesion over completeness. In considering what the tablets do not say, one gains insight into both the limitations of record and the mechanisms that sustain civilization. Clay, reed, ink, and voice interact to produce a curated past, one that is inseparable from the cultural pressures that shape it. The city's survival relied on this balance between recording and omitting, on the careful shaping of narrative to reinforce hierarchy, ritual, and social order. Couriers and scribes, working silently in corridors and chambers, became the unseen architects of memory, their decisions echoing centuries later in the fragments that endure. Every crack, missing line, and smudged impression carries both loss and instruction, reminding the modern observer that history is rarely whole, that absence has substance, and that the epic itself is as much a product of selection as of event. In the shadows of the archive, in the quiet spaces where light falls faintly upon shelves and the faint odor of clay lingers, one can almost hear the careful deliberation of centuries, what to preserve, what to leave unsaid, and how the invisible hand of cultural pressure, not malice, shapes what survives. The city's memory, filtered through absence, becomes a mirror of its priorities. What is remembered is safe, what is omitted is controlled, and the gaps themselves instruct those who follow. The silent machinery of record, the unseen deliberations of scribes, the careful orchestration of ritual and authority, all converge to produce a history that is at once partial and profound. In examining the spaces between the tablets, one sees not failure but intention, a civilization managing its own memory with patience, subtlety, and care, leaving us with a glimpse of both what existed and what, deliberately or inevitably, passed into quiet oblivion. Long after the walls of Uruk had settled into the silence of memory, After the canals had silted and shifted with seasons, no living witness could recount. The figure of Gilgamesh persisted not as a man, but as a measure, a template by which rulers and scribes came to understand power, ambition, and the delicate interplay between authority and mortality. The city itself had faded into archaeological shadow, yet the story embedded within it had acquired a life independent of geography. In dimly lit chambers of later cities, clay tablets bearing the epic were consulted not for narrative alone but for precedent, as though Gilgamesh's choices could serve as a ledger of acceptable action. Temples and administrative centers alike referenced him subtly, his deeds codified as models for behavior. A king must be strong, yet measured, bold, yet obedient to divine law, decisive, yet attentive to counsel. The narrative had moved beyond biography into methodology. Couriers carried copies of the epic across the Euphrates and the Tigris, paddling through silence, their voices echoing passages that emphasized heroism in moderation and ambition within bounds. Every repetition reinforced patterns of governance. The scribes who transmitted the text understood that Gilgamesh's legend functioned less as entertainment than as a tool for shaping collective understanding of authority. In this, the epic was curatorial, a living archive whose influence stretched across generations. It was studied in small, secluded rooms, where officials and priests weighed phrases, noting which episodes were suitable for public edification and which carried subtle warnings about hubris and excess. Here, the epic's human protagonist became a mirror of institutional need. One tablet emphasized the construction of walls and the management of labor, framing these acts as heroic achievement, yet quietly instructive in the moral economy of power. Another highlighted friendships and grief, underscoring the ruler's dependence on counsel and human alliance. Divine interactions, so central to the original story, were now integrated as templates of mediation. The king, even in supreme authority, was never entirely autonomous, and recognition of cosmic or social order was necessary for enduring rule. In these archives, Gilgamesh was less an individual and more a set of parameters. His actions, recorded and repeated, were distilled into guidelines for leadership. Later kings, from Uruk's immediate successors to distant rulers who had never seen the city, encountered his story as codified behavior, ambition tempered by ritual, courage bound by responsibility, mortality acknowledged as inevitable but navigable. Across Mesopotamia, the epic functioned as a subtle pedagogy, teaching not by decree but through narrative resonance. In palace corridors, where sunlight barely reached and the smell of baked clay lingered, the epic was read aloud to apprentices and scribes, each repetition reinforcing norms and expectations. Courtiers memorized episodes, their tones measured, gestures controlled, their performance itself a lesson in propriety. In this way, Gilgamesh became a bridge between memory and practice, linking historical precedent to contemporary governance. The transformation of his narrative into a template did not occur by few. It was cumulative, arising from centuries of selective preservation, careful repetition, and editorial refinement. Scribes inherited a story that was already curated, and their additions, erasures, marginal notes, reorganizations reinforced the patterns the text now embodied. The epic's survival across time and space was tied to this slow evolution. Where human memory faltered, tablets endured, and where tablets were fragmented, oral tradition supplied a measure of consistency. Over generations, the figure of Gilgamesh stabilized, his persona abstracted into a guide for power rather than a recounting of individual exploits. This abstraction allowed rulers far removed from Uruk to adopt the narrative as moral and administrative instruction. Walls and canals, once physical necessities of a city-state, were reframed as symbols of order and management, their construction and maintenance reflecting disciplined exercise of authority. Heroism, once personal and occasionally chaotic, became a formalized measure of acceptable initiative, guiding leaders toward decisive action tempered by communal need. Even failures recorded within the epic were read as lessons in prudence. Ambition unchecked could threaten the state. Grief unassimilated could undermine continuity. Hubris against divine law could destabilize the social fabric. In distant archives, where tablets lay stacked in shadowed rooms and oil lamps flickered over ancient writing, the epic's lessons were considered quietly, without dramatization. Rulers were advised, indirectly, by example, and by absence. What was omitted from the epic signaled boundaries as clearly as what was included. This subtle pedagogy extended beyond Mesopotamia, influencing neighboring polities through trade, conquest, and diplomacy. Couriers moving silently along rivers or desert tracks carried tablets, which, when read aloud, instructed in the art of balance between human desire and societal expectation, between innovation and tradition, between courage and restraint. In these silent transmissions, the epic's power lay not in spectacle but in cumulative reinforcement. By the time Uruk itself had passed fully into ruin, Gilgamesh had long ceased to be only a city's hero. He had become a structural principle, a symbolic measure of leadership, his narrative shaping the contours of governance, ritual, and moral expectation. The epic's text, carefully curated, allowed rulers to perceive their own authority as bounded and guided, providing historical legitimacy without direct precedent. In private chambers, where officials debated resource allocation or legal resolution, the epic served as reference, its episodes quietly framing decisions. Builders, soldiers, and administrators all internalized the patterns that the narrative suggested. Consciously or unconsciously, Gilgamesh's presence was systemic in the layout of cities, in the timing of festivals, in the articulation of law, and in the measured recording of events. His story transcended biography to become architecture, both literal and figurative, guiding human action in accordance with inherited memory. Even emotion was calibrated through these teachings. Grief, joy, and loyalty were legible within narrative expectation. Uncontrolled impulses were absent or moderated. The epic's careful construction allowed it to endure as template, not merely tale, its form preserving social and political equilibrium across generations. The machinery behind this endurance remained invisible, composed of scribes, temple archivists, and silent couriers, each layer performing countless small acts of selection, correction, and repetition. Light from flickering lamps illuminated only the surfaces of clay, yet shadows hinted at complexity, at processes too subtle for casual observation. Every erasure, every marginal note, every repetition reinforced the epic's role as a model of governance. Human ambition, mortality, and achievement were rendered into repeatable patterns, guiding rulers who would never know the original city. In this long unfolding, Gilgamesh became a template not through force or fame, but through the meticulous accumulation of curated memory, preserved across centuries in rooms where decisions were made quietly, where light barely touched the clay, where the unseen work of administration and ritual shaped understanding as much as the narrative itself. The epic's influence persisted not because it told a good story, but because it instructed with subtlety, demonstrating that authority, heroism, and the negotiation between mortal and divine were matters to be measured, practiced, and inherited. By the time the city of Uruk itself had returned to dust and canal beds, Gilgamesh's narrative had assumed a permanence beyond its original context, a template embedded within the moral and political imagination of empires, a slow, deliberate inheritance of order, a testament to the unseen labor of those who curated memory with patience and care, shaping history not only through what was said, but through what was preserved, repeated, and quietly refined. In the quiet spaces where the weight of centuries settles into dust and shadow, the fragments of Uruk endure like faint heartbeats of a city long silenced. Clay tablets, splintered and worn, sit in low shelves or half-forgotten drawers, their surfaces etched with impressions that are at once deliberate and vulnerable, marking a world that existed both in action and in absence. Some tablets are incomplete, their lines broken by fire, flood, or neglect. Others bear smudges where hands pressed too quickly, impatience or fatigue leaving subtle traces of human presence. Each fragment is a whisper from a time before record-keeping became history, a tangible echo of the people who labored, worshipped, and governed within the city's walls. The names of rulers, heroes, and scribes are preserved in uneven clarity. Gilgamesh himself appears across these fragments as both figure and symbol, occasionally whole, sometimes only half visible through gaps in the text. These glimpses resist complete comprehension, reminding those who study them that memory is selective, that survival favors what is codified, not necessarily what was lived. In dimly lit rooms where archivists and scholars move slowly among shelves, the smell of aged clay and faint smoke from lamps fills the air, lending gravity to the act of observation. Dust motes float like tiny particles of time, catching light as they drift above rows of tablets, as though the past itself hovers, unclaimed yet persistent. Decisions once made in small chambers of palace or temple echo here, a line omitted for stability, a name preserved for continuity, a ritual recounted or left unmarked, all converge to shape the contours of what remains. Human agency is present in these echoes, but filtered through layers of necessity, prudence, and cultural preservation. The city's machinery of memory, once invisible and ongoing, has left only traces: the arrangement of archives, the deliberate repetition of certain stories, the consistent absences that suggest unspoken rules. Through these, one can discern the city's priorities, its anxieties, and the subtle moral frameworks that guided rulers, scribes, and priests alike. Gilgamesh emerges from this sedimented past not as a solved figure, but as a measure of what societies elect to remember. His deeds, partially recorded, partially inferred, demonstrate how authority, heroism, and human ambition were codified, tempered, and repeated across time. Fragments preserve instruction as much as event: a tablet that lists offerings, a scribal note on ritual precision, a ceremonial recounting of conquest, all articulate social and political ideals that outlast individuals, even the kings who enacted them. In reading these remnants, one senses the unceasing labor of record itself: hands shaping clay, oil lamps flickering across scribal surfaces, shadows stretching across walls as decisions were weighed in rooms too small to contain them fully. The choices of omission are as telling as the marks that survive. Absences signify boundaries, reveal what was considered too dangerous, too volatile, or too mundane to memorialize. The human record is inherently uneven, a mosaic of deliberate preservation and unavoidable loss. Across Mesopotamia and beyond, as empires rose and fell, these fragments traveled, sometimes carried by silent couriers along rivers and trade routes, sometimes buried beneath layers of sediment, later excavated by hands that could neither see nor hear the lives they touched. Each displacement further inscribed uncertainty into the narrative, yet paradoxically ensured the endurance of the epic's essence. Ritual performances, repeated over generations, helped anchor the story even as physical fragments decayed. Stories were remembered aloud, retold in temple courtyards, in marketplaces, along canals and roads. These oral traces compensated for gaps, preserving rhythm, tone, and lesson where clay could not. In this interplay between the tangible and ephemeral, the human record extends beyond mere survival. It becomes a meditation on the conditions of remembrance, a reflection on how civilizations sculpt memory from necessity, reverence, and chance. Gilgamesh himself is inseparable from this process. He is at once a historical figure, a mythic exemplar, and a curatorial product of human intent. His narrative illustrates the selective endurance of experience, showing that what survives is not always the most dramatic or the most complete, but that which is repeatedly deemed meaningful, teachable, or manageable. Scholars working in shadowed archives sense the layers of human decision embedded in each fragment: the shaping of story, the framing of heroism, the careful modulation of conflict and mortality. Even broken lines and missing phrases communicate intention. They demonstrate the invisible hand of culture and administration, of moral and political priorities, steering memory across centuries. Within these quiet reflections, the ruins of Uruk speak not only of the past but of processes that outlast it. Empire is remembered unevenly, its achievements and failures transmitted selectively, its stories curated by those who understood the consequences of record-keeping. The city's decline, its eventual ruin, does not erase its presence. It converts it into resonance, a series of echoes that travel through fragments, oral transmission, and ritualized repetition. In this way, memory becomes both fragile and durable, delicate in its medium yet resilient in its effect. Contemporary eyes perceive the enduring fragments as evidence, but the true substance lies in the pattern of preservation itself, in the choices to retain some episodes and omit others, in the slow accretion of selective memory over generations. Gilgamesh remains central not because his story is fully recoverable, but because it exemplifies the principle of endurance, a civilization remembering itself through fragments, through ritual, through text, and through repetition. The half-remembered names of laborers, soldiers, priests, and scribes, glimpsed only occasionally across surviving tablets, remind us that history privileges certain voices while muffling others, yet all contribute, consciously or not, to the city's ongoing legacy. Every broken tablet, every erasure, every fragment is a meditation on impermanence, yet it also constitutes proof of survival, that memory, no matter how partial, continues to exert influence. In studying these remnants, the observer enters a quiet dialogue with time itself. Lamps flicker over shelves. Dust settles slowly. Fingers trace lines pressed into clay millennia ago. In these acts of engagement, the city persists not as empire or myth alone, but as a living archive of human endeavor, aspiration, and decision. ruins and fragments become more than evidence. They are active participants in the shaping of understanding. The story of Gilgamesh, filtered through absence and presence, reminds the modern witness that history is not a mirror, but a construction, a deliberate preservation of certain elements, a conscious or unconscious neglect of others. The human record, uneven and fragmentary, is nevertheless instructive, offering insight into priorities, values, and cultural imagination. In this enduring resonance, one sees how civilizations define themselves not merely by what they do, but by what they choose to remember and how they arrange memory across space, time, and medium. Even centuries later, the echo of Uruk persists in clay, in ritual, in oral cadence, in the measured repetition of pattern. Gilgamesh's legacy is not closure, it is reflection. He stands among fragments, half visible, reminding us that survival is partial and meaning uneven, and that the shaping of memory is itself an act of profound human deliberation. Through broken tablets, through faintly preserved names, through the ritualized repetition of stories and deeds, we understand that history is curated, that endurance is selective, and that civilizations, in preserving their own memory, leave behind both evidence and silence. In these quiet traces, Uruk breathes still, in clay, in shadow, in the careful alignment of fragments that convey continuity, purpose, and the human desire to remember. The epic, the ruins, and the echoes converge into a meditation on the fragility and persistence of human record, teaching that what survives is never complete, yet what endures shapes understanding, perception, and the enduring presence of civilizations long vanished, their choices, their omissions, and their memory forming the still living architecture of history itself.